So in today's video, I'm going to be going through some burning questions that have been sent through from a mixture of students of the Leathercraft Masterclass and also people that have contacted me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And some of these questions are really interesting, and I thought it would be better to answer everybody as a group, as a community, rather than just answering one individual person. I can answer them and potentially thousands of other people at the same time, sharing my knowledge a little bit more than just one individual. So I've got here 10 questions that I get very often. Some of them you might be familiar with, some of them are completely random. So that's what I'm doing today. At the same time, I'm doing a little bit of stitch work here on this briefcase. This is coming out very shortly. This is the English briefcase course. We have done the handle making component already, which is currently under wraps, as you can see. What I'm doing today is stitching in the steel reinforcement on the inside with a strip of leather on the rear side, which I can show you a little bit later on once I've actually finished this seam. But you can see it protruding here. It's going to get cut to width once all the stitching is finished, so it'll be nice and flush. So underneath this piece here is a steel strip, which is what we rivet onto to give support for the D-ring and also the handle attachment, which is what the handle is on or held in place by. So that's what I'm doing today. A little bit of stitch work, a little bit of answering of your questions. So without further ado, let's start on our first question. That is, what's the best leather for making a wallet? Now, of course, the answer is it depends on what type of wallet you're making. Now, if you're an absolute beginner, I'd probably recommend using something with a bit more stiffness and a little bit more forgiveness, like vegetable tanned leather. It doesn't require as much skill to make a wallet from veg tan as it does from chrome tan leathers, soft chrome tan leathers, or indeed soft vegetable tan leathers, which do exist. Generally, because veg tan, as you can see, is quite stiff. Okay, this piece is actually able to hold itself up almost like board. If this was chrome tan leather, it would be flopping over to the side. So you don't need to add reinforcement to it. So if you're making a wallet from veg tan leather, that's one component that you don't need to add in yourself, which is some kind of stiffener, some kind of reinforcement, which could be anywhere from cellulose board to Villadon, could be bonded leather board, anything like that, which adds stiffness to chrome tan leathers. And you might be thinking, well, why would you use chrome tan leathers then? Well, chrome tan leather is very soft. So if you wanted to make a nice soft wallet, but you don't want it to be completely limp, then adding a little bit of stiffness definitely helps. So if you're brand new, what leather should you use? I'd reckon veg tan leather, calf vegetable tan leather, something nice and fine. It was going to be quite nice to work with as well. So that would be my recommendation. If you're a bit more advanced, then you can use anything from regular cowhide chrome tan leather to combination tanned chrome tan leathers, and indeed exotic leather skins such as crocodile, alligator, lizard, ostrich, etc. Now, you don't have to stiffen too much. There is such thing as too much, because when you think about it, when you design a wallet, make a wallet, it's okay if it's a little bendy, because what do we add to wallets? Credit cards, cash, things like that. And even if you had one wallet which was really, really soft and bendy, put one credit card in there and it would stiffen it up considerably. And if you've got nothing in there, you're not going to be carrying it as a wallet, are you? So anytime we're carrying a wallet, we've got cards, we've got cash, and all sorts of things that make something quite stiff. So you don't have to go overboard on adding stiffness. So that's something to note. So next question that I get asked quite often is, how do I dye leather? How do I dye leather? Specifically by hand. Now, I've always recommended to people, if you have the choice, then try and get leather that is pre-dyed from the tannery with the color that you actually want, rather than try and do it yourself. But sometimes you just want to make a small item, a one-off, perhaps it's for a customer or someone's birthday and they like a particular color, And you don't want to buy an entire hide just for that small object, maybe a wallet. So you think to yourself, I'll get some undyed vegetable tan leather, I'll hand dye it myself, which is perfectly reasonable. Or it's just cost prohibitive to, keep buying leather with all sorts of different colors, because that can get very expensive, especially if you want it in different thicknesses and etc., etc. So that's when you want to really consider hand dyeing leather. My recommendation is obviously using vegetable tan leather is going to be a little bit easier, and you're going to find more often crust leather or undyed veg tan leather readily available from most places. And when it comes to dyes, most of the time, as long as you don't mix oil with spirit or spirit with water and things like that, then you can actually mix dyes of the same batch. I think there are exceptions, but most commonly you can. So that allows you to get a little bit more creative with it. When it comes to the dyeing process, some simple tips that I can give you is number one, wear gloves. Even if you don't think you're going to need to, always wear gloves. Two is prepare the surface of the leather. When I say prepare, oftentimes, even if you've gone for, crust leather, undyed veg tan, it may have come in contact with a waxy leather like this English bridle. It may have brushed up against some bridle leather at the supplier. Okay, maybe they threw it on top momentarily for whatever reason, and some of the wax has come off. That really slows down the absorption of dye. So as you're applying it, some areas are soaking in quickly and some areas are almost rejecting it if there's anything on the surface, and that can really come out really patchy and not in a good kind of rustic way, in just a really bad way. So always prepare the surface. A simple one, if you can't buy a leather cleaner, is just some mild saddle soap with a sponge, and just go over the surface. Just clean the surface. Don't have to use too much, and then just let it dry. And then you can go ahead, use a sponge and add your dye, whether it be oil-based, spirit-based, or water-based. Then once you've finished, it's always good to get a damp cloth and go over the surface and try and get off as much as you can. Any kind of rub off. Okay, so if you're making a handbag and someone might be wearing them against a pair of white jeans, you don't want that coming off. So you want to remove as much as you can, and then you want to seal it with something. So some people can use wax. Bag coat by Fibings is another one. Acrylic Resin if you want to, really kind of waterproof it. Those are all good options that you can use. But a good quality dye is quite resistant to rub off, but you still want to try and get off as much as you can with a damp cloth before sealing it. So there's just a few basic tips for hand dyeing leather. And if you really want to get good penetration of dye, which gives a more depth of color, one little tip that I can give you as well is when you finish dyeing it, leave it a few minutes to soak through so that it's not sitting on the surface. So give it a few minutes, 5 minutes to soak through, and while it's still damp, turn the piece of leather grain side down, okay, so flesh side up, against a piece of plastic. And when I say plastic, like plastic sheeting, that kind of thing, Ziploc bag, whatever. And then let it dry that way. And it dries much slower, but it can only kind of dry through the flesh side. And as whatever it is, the oil, the spirit, the water is evaporating through the flesh side, it's pulling the dye through, the dye solids through the grain, so you get deeper penetration of your dye. And that will give you a much nicer surface as well. Okay, so moving on to next question. So what tools do I need to get started in leathercraft? So this is a really popular one, and my recommendation would be to go to leathercraftmasterclass.com, and in there, in the beginner class, you're going to get an entire list of tools, my recommendations from all the different suppliers, plus links and everything you need to get started, whether you're a beginner, whether you're intermediate, or whether you're advanced. So that's the Leathercraft beginner class, linked on my website below. And that's going to give you everything you need to know. There's also a video on how to buy leather as well, which is, I think, absolutely crucial for people just starting out. But in general, don't go overboard. Get the basics. Don't spend too much initially, because you're probably going to upgrade a little bit later on. There's nothing wrong with starting out a project, realizing that there's one or two tools that you actually need that you haven't got, buying those, waiting for them to come in, and then carrying on. You're going to see that quite a bit as you go along. You're always going to come across at some point, maybe a more advanced project, you just go, oh, there's a tool for this and I need this. I'm going to have to go and get that. And that's, you know, I've done that myself time and time again. And then over the years, you start to build up an entire tool collection. It's not something that happens overnight. It would be very expensive if you tried to do it all at once. So just accept that sometimes you're going to have to wait for a delivery of a new tool if you need it. But try not to buy too many tools at once, because you don't know now what you know in a year's time, 2 years' time, and you might look back and think, why did I buy that? It was a terrible purchase. So don't go too crazy, although it's very tempting. Tool collecting is a hobby in itself. How do I stitch leather by hand? Very common question. My recommendation is to get the free video that I have on this. Okay, so rather than just try and explain it, go to leathercraftmasterclass.com. There's a pop-up. Just enter your email address and I'll send you a free video which shows you exactly how to hand stitch leather with cameras on both sides, showing you in detail with explanations of what to do. So start there. Start with that free video. Costs you absolutely nothing. And I'll show you exactly how to hand stitch rather than try and describe it. So what's the difference between full grain leather and genuine leather? What's the difference between full grain leather and genuine leather? Well, genuine leather, the most common accepted definition is a piece of split leather which has had a grain printed onto it. So at the tannery, generally they will split. You have an upper split and a lower split. The upper split goes for high quality leather goods, such as this, for example, which will be full grain leather. And a lower split, depending on the tanning method, if it's chrome tan, it'll probably go to something like suede. But generally speaking, a lower split will have a layer of polyurethane sprayed onto the front of it to give it a color. And then it will have some kind of grain pressed into it. So it could be a roller that it goes through. It could be a large block press that comes down using heat and pressure and gives like a fake grain look to it. So that's the lower quality split. Generally speaking, genuine leather doesn't last as long as full grain leather, which has had minimal treatment to the surface. I think technically it can have some mild buffing or cleaning done to the surface before it goes into the next category, which is top grain leather. But genuine leather is aptly named because it makes people think that it's a grade of leather that is like real leather. This is leather, but it's not. It's kind of a grade of leather. Some people disagree, and that's absolutely fine, about the definition of what it is, but the most common definition is a bottom split with a fake grain or a finish over the top, masquerading as full grain leather usually. So cheap shoes, couches, and things like that. So next question, can I use vegetable tanned leather for making a bag? Can I use vegetable tanned leather for making a bag? It would be a bit weird if I said no, because I'm currently making a bag with vegetable tanned leather. So evidently, yes, you can. What's the difference between a vegetable tan leather bag and a chrome tan leather bag? Well, like I mentioned earlier with the wallet, you're going to have a wallet that's soft or firm, depending on the kind of leather that you choose. So I'm going to move this forward. If I made this bag from chrome tan leather and then reinforced it with stiffeners to make it work, I would just have a much softer feel to this, okay? With vegetable tan leather, which this is, it's a much firmer feel, okay? Depending on your opinion, English leather goods most commonly uses bridal leather and vegetable tan leather, which makes it more of a masculine product in my opinion. If you're making a more feminine product like a handbag, then a softer chrome tan leather, generally softer vegetable tan leathers and things like that are going to give a very different feel to the bag. Okay, so it's a little bit more of a, I guess, a luxurious feel, a soft feel to it. So those are the main differences. So can you make a bag from vegetable tan leather? Yes, you can. But some styles of bag, especially handbags, aren't really that well suited to very firm leathers, firm veg tan. You know, as much as I love veg tan bags that have a lot of character, where you can see slight color variation, it's a real natural look. There's certain handbag designs that just don't really work well with that, and it looks a little bit odd. You want chrome tan leather for a handbag that has a very uniform color across the surface. It's more the design that speaks than the leather itself. It might not be, purists may not agree with that. But so moving on, how do I condition and care for leather products? How do I condition and care for leather products? So when I've finished making this bag, this might not need it as much because it does get stuffed with fats and oils and greases and things like that from the tannery. But I will still go over it with polish or some kind of leather cream to protect the surface, especially areas that I've been stitching or I've been bending, manipulating. You know, this handle, for example, gets a conditioning wax when it's finished. Because of the shape of it, the leather is getting bent and the grain is opening up. So you need some kind of conditioning to finish creating a bag. There's a few different ones. You know, there's one by Fibings, Canorba Cream is a good one. Saphir makes rejuvenators, which conditions and softens the leather and also adds a little bit of shine as well. Probably overall, Saphir is going to have the best products for that use. But there are generally two types. A wax is something that sits on the surface and protects it from the elements. So it protects it from or reduces the chances of staining, and that includes water staining if it's veg tan. So if it gets caught in the rain, you won't get water spots when they dry. And then you have something that actually soaks into the leather and gets in between the grain, okay? So really gets inside the leather and allows the leather to soften, re-adds moisture that it may have lost, especially if it's old. But one thing I'd warn against is adding too much oil to your leather goods, because oil isn't actually softening, it's lubricating, and that's why it loosens up leather. But I can't remember if it was, I think it was Alaska State University that did some studies on this, and they do a lot of museum work where they're getting leather in that could be hundreds or thousands of years old, and it needs some kind of conditioning work. They did experiments and found out, I think it's 13% by weight of leather, when you're adding oil to it, begins to drive out moisture, okay? So adding too much oil to leather can actually dry out, even though initially it feels softer. We think, well, why does it feel softer if it's actually drying it out? Well, the fibers that cross paths with each other, when you add oil between them, it lubricates them. So it actually reduces the friction of the fibers as the leather moves around in your fingers. The fibers are moving past each other, okay? Because it's like a non-woven material. You start adding oil to that, you're going to get some lubrication, but it begins driving out the water. So you think, okay, it's starting to dry out again, it's stiffening up, I need to add a little bit more oil. Well, eventually, there's so little water content or moisture in it, and so much oil, that you end up getting the leather to crack over time if you're moving it. It's almost like, if you replace water with oil in a crisp or a potato chip, depending on where you're from, it gets harder, doesn't it? And it snaps easily, even though it's full of oil. So it's in a similar way, if you add too much oil, you tend to dry the leather out over time, which causes cracking. So there is such a thing as over-conditioning leather, which is why a lot of the creams that you get are actually a mixture of water and oils, so that you're not adding too much oil, but you are adding moisture at the same time. So just a little tip there for you that might help. What's the next question that we have? What's the difference between saddle stitching and lock stitching? So what's the difference between a saddle stitch, which is what I'm doing here, and lock stitching, which is what would essentially be holding my my overalls together? Well, lock stitching is a machine stitch, essentially. Saddle stitching is probably a lot more like weaving. Okay, so you've got thread that's going in and out. So this one I'm actually doing a cast, which means there's an overhand knot in between each stitch for added strength, and it also adds a nice angle on both sides. But if I were to cut one side, make a little slit in the thread, well, there is another one weaving in and out, going the opposite direction. So essentially, it makes the product a lot more durable. On machine stitch or lock stitch, the thread on this side doesn't actually go through to the opposite side. It locks over the bottom layer. So you could actually have blue thread on the top on machine stitching like this, which is navy, matching everything. And I could have red on the inside. Whereas I can't do that on hand stitching because it's constantly going in and out. So this stitch here, the opposite side is going out the other side, and then the next one comes out and in and out and in. So it's constantly going in and out, in and out, in and out. Whereas a machine stitch just locks onto the other thread like that. And thread can actually cut into itself. I don't know if any of you are into fishing, but generally you have the strength, the test strength of the line on fishing line, how strong it is, just say 10 pounds. But its knot strength, so when you knot it over itself, might be actually considerably lower because thread is cutting into itself, or the line in that case is cutting into itself. So you have less strength. So a saddle stitch is going to be a little bit stronger than a lock stitch. But as you can see, if I was using a sewing machine, this would have taken me not very long to stitch. And by hand, it takes considerably longer. So it really depends on what kind of leather goods you're making, how much time you have, which is important if you're a business. It also makes a difference in how much you charge for your work as well, if that's something you're into. But also, it's a lot more economical to stitch by hand than it is to invest in, sometimes 1, 2, or 3 different types of sewing machines, because not all sewing machines stitch everything in leather goods. So it can be very expensive if you want to start buying sewing machines for leather. There are obviously cheaper ways of doing it, and you can compromise, but even if you go for a cheaper setup, it's still going to be more expensive than 2 needles, a piece of thread, pricking iron, and perhaps even an awl, maybe not even that. So the startup costs are a lot cheaper on hand stitching, but of course you pay for it in time and also the skill necessary to do it. So that's something to consider. Moving on to the next question. How do I make leather goods water resistant? Now this is something that I have been asked time and time again, and not always by students and those interested in leathercraft, but people that have contacted me from various different companies asking my thoughts on waterproofing leather. Everybody would love leather to be completely waterproof. But I've said it before to a lot of people, if you're looking for something, if you're looking for a waterproof material, leather really isn't it. It's not something that you want to have completely waterproof. You might be thinking, well, why not? What's wrong with having waterproof leather? It's very difficult to make something waterproof yet breathable at the same time, and then be able to apply it over the top of your leather in some kind of liquid form. If it completely blocks water out, for example, if you can pour water on it and leave it overnight and it's waterproof, it can't also breathe at the same time. So leather can dry out much more easily, and you can't feed the leather either. So if you're preventing water from soaking into the grain, then you're also preventing any kind of nourishing creams over time that leather naturally needs, especially vegetable tan leather in particular. So, it's always a compromise. So something like this, English bridle leather, has a lot of wax on it, okay? You might be able to see that there. There's quite a bit of wax on the surface. And if I went outside and it was raining, and I came back in, it had water on it, I could wipe it off with a tissue and it'd probably be absolutely fine. There wouldn't be any watermarks or any water spots or anything like that. But if I were to leave it out in the rain for any extended period of time, it's going to get wet. Now, does that matter? If your leather goods gets occasionally wet, not really, okay? It can stain the surface depending on what type of leather it is. If you've gone for a really natural veg tan and you've just put a little bit of a wax finish over the top and you've made a bag, then it's asking for water spots really, which is where water gets on it and then it dries. It's a slight shade difference in color. So something like this, darker color, is it going to matter if it gets wet occasionally and then dries out slowly? Not really. It's a little bit like shoes. If you get your leather shoes wet outside, do you have to throw them away afterwards? Not really. If you get your belt wet for whatever reason, is it a problem? Not really. If it's repeatedly made wet, then dry, then wet, then dry, then wet, then dry, then over time, you'll start to get cracking, especially where there's any flexibility involved. So that's just something to be aware of. But if you really want to make something water resistant, something like bag coat makes a good water resistant layer. Anything with a heavy wax finish is going to have some water resistance to it. Acrylic Resolene, I'll show you what that looks like. Acrylic Resolene, which is this one here by Fibings. That gives it quite a shiny look to the surface. If you have add 1 to 2 thick layers or neat without any dilution, then you get a little bit of a shiny surface, and it can be quite almost waterproof, but not quite, not really. You might be able to pour water on it and then wipe it off shortly afterwards, and it's fine. But it's still one of those products I'd be very wary of it for drying out leather, because you can't condition it once that's done. A good compromise is something like bag coat, which is contains, what is it now, shellac, yeah. So it's a very old traditional finish, been using this for centuries. Something like that adds water resistance, but it still allows the leather to breathe. It does add a little bit of shine to it, to the surface, but it doesn't feel plasticky like acrylic Resolene can. But if you're wanting to make something completely waterproof, like an architect asked me once what he can use for he created some tables, interior architect, and he made them all veg tan. And he was having real problems because clients were getting upset. You know, their glass of wine would spill slightly or it would drip and they'd leave it on their table. And even though they wax the surface, it still soaks in and looks terrible. And I was saying, you're just not really going to find a finish that's going to live up to that kind of abuse in a hot coffee cup or, you know, spilling hot coffee on it. You're not really going to find it. It's not the right material for it. You know, the only way around it would probably be put a sheet of glass over the top of it so you can still see it, but it's it's protecting it. All right, so let's move on to the next question. And this is question number 10 now. How do I create a design on leather using carving or stamping techniques? So I'm not sure if you're talking about tooling here. I can't remember who asked this. I'm just going to keep going like that. But stamping is something we do in Leathercraft, unless you're talking Western, of course, which is where you put your logo on your work. Now, you can do that by hand, or you can use a press, like an arbor press. But it will need a design, usually something machined in brass with your logo on it, so that you have a design ready to go, and then you can press it in. Now, some people have their design, their stamp, their logo on something that they can actually hammer into the leather. It's a little bit less consistent than placing down a stamp and using an arbor press to push it in. But that's one way of doing it. The way that I do it is I have a hot foil machine over there, which also allows me to do blind stamping, which is a process without using foil. So you're just taking my logo and then pressing it in with a little bit of heat and pressure to stamp your logo. So there are cheaper ways of doing it, but they're generally less precise. But using a full-size machine like the one over there, which is a metallic elephant, that's, you know, £1,500, $2,000, something like that, and that's without any kind of any dies or logos to use on them. So it can get a little bit expensive if you do it that way. So coming to the end here now, so almost done on this briefcase. So in a few days from release on this video, this new course will be out. And in it, you're going to learn how to rivet, how to attach these kind of handles, and also how to reinforce using steel. And this isn't something that requires real specialist equipment. It's just basic equipment that you probably already have to add steel on the inside. And the reason we do that is to add stiffness, because if I create a bag like this, a briefcase like this, and I don't have anything reinforcing on the inside, if I put in a laptop, maybe two laptops, my phone, a book, a notepad, it starts to get quite heavy. And as I'm lifting, it starts to put a lot more stress on the leather. Even though it's stiff leather, it's not overly thick. It's not like belt level thick. So you can start to warp the leather over time and change its shape. So adding steel, especially spring steel specifically, so that it regains its shape after use, will significantly reduce the chances of damage. And the handles are not actually putting any pressure on the leather. The handles themselves, the pressure is going through the rivet, which is supported on the opposite side on the steel, which runs the entire length. So all the stress is spread out. And on the ends, we have a rivet which holds on the D-ring here. And that's where the shoulder strap attachment is actually going to go. So even when I've got it on the shoulder, instead of holding it with my hand, the stress is again transferred along the entire length of the strip of steel. So that makes a lot of difference to the longevity of it. It's a traditional way of doing it as well. You'll see them on older Dunhill bags, Swain Edney Brigg, Ettinger, and you know, going back 100 years, Finnegan's, and some of the older ones that I've refurbished over the years. You'll notice a very similar design. I don't know who came up with the idea originally, but it certainly makes for a stronger, better, more resilient bag. Almost at the end here now, and what I'm going to do is just turn this around and show it on camera. Because there's a strip of leather that actually hides all the rivet work. Now it's impossible to have it completely flat on the other side. So you always see a bit of a lump and a bump here and there, which is where the rivets go. And that's just the way it's been done throughout the years. So a back stitch here, locking that in with a couple of casts. Thread snips. Okay, so let's take this out of the clams and take a look on the rear side. We'll still need tapping down, but we'll get the general idea. So along the front, you can see here, either side of the steel strip, we have two seams running along the length, okay? And what that's attaching is this piece along the back, okay? So you can feel where the handles are, but you can't necessarily see them. So it would be a bit unsightly just to leave this bare. There are other ways you can make a feature out of it. You can wrap the steel bar in leather and have it on display, and then have the rivets going through, and then, you know, making decorative rivets, for example. That's another way I've seen it being done. But it has to be quite thin leather that you wrap the bar with, and I don't know how long that's going to last. But something like this, which is the traditional way of doing it, you know, we're using a thicker piece of leather going over the top, so it's going to last a long time. This will actually get bent over. So this will be the top of the briefcase. We won't be bending it in just yet, but that will give you a general idea. So underneath here is that steel strip, which is what the rivets for the handle attachments, the shaps, and the D-ring, which will be for the shoulder strap. So that is what I've been doing today. Guys, I hope you enjoyed those 10 questions. I hope it's giving you some food for thought. If you have any ideas, you know, continuations on some of my answers, any of your own personal experiences, give a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions as well. If you like this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to get your free hand stitching video tutorial, leathercraftmasterclass.com, linked below. Go and grab it today. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you again very soon.